Let's go now to Redbridge Group Director Simon Welsh. Simon, thanks so much for your time. You are deep in focus group and looking at numbers territory. We've seen the trend now for the coalition going the wrong way for them. You've looked at two key, or been able to identify from the groups, two key problems. What are they?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Yeah, the first one is a similar problem that we saw for Labor earlier in the campaign, which is where the Liberals are losing primary vote right now. It's sort of hiving off onto the minor parties, So think particularly those on their right flank. So think of those voters that are really animated about immigration, really animated about ripping money out of federal government. The Liberals have sort of offered them a light approach to that, but they want the full fat version. So they're sort of heading off towards One Nation, Trumpet of Patriots, those sorts of things. Now, a lot of that will swing back to the Libs on two-party preferred, but not all of it. We know once people come off to primary, they do scatter a little bit, but most of that will come back. But I feel like that's kind of the defining feature of this election, is that where the major parties are losing big chunks of votes, not enough of it is transferring to the other major party, whether that's Labor losing votes or whether that's Liberals losing votes. So you end up with a much narrower range of seats where they're in the prospects of potentially taking off each other. You've got to have seats that were marginal to begin with, and where those primary votes for both major parties are high enough to put them in striking distance if they only get a small proportion of the vote that's coming off. That's problem number one. Problem number two for the Liberals is that we just see there just isn't enough movement in the under 40-year-old vote. Mm-hmm. So we're still sort of seeing Labor hold 60-40, generalised across the nation. There's like geographic location variation on that, but 60-40 rule of thumb in that under 40 vote. The problem is that under 40 vote is now so dominant in a lot of these outer suburban marginal electorates in Western Sydney, Western Melbourne, North Melbourne, that acts as it's a great head start for Labor, let's put it that way, to have 60% of what is in some places 40 to 50% of the electorate now. So some real sort of headwinds there that, as I say, sort of really start to narrow in the possible range of seats, to the point that I think we're probably looking right now, a couple of weeks ago, but right now we'd probably be looking at sort of the Libs maybe being able to get to the low 60s, Labor maybe being able to get to the low 70s, and a whole bunch of stuff in the middle sort of going off to independents, third parties, those sorts of things. But still time, but those sort of structural problems are pretty difficult to get around.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's big spending as well, and the Liberal Party, the Conservatives, haven't been tempted to go down the fiscal restraint path. We've seen that in an election campaign, that's really hard to do. But the comparison between the slide for the coalition and the slide for Labor when Bill Shorten was leader, I think is really interesting, because they're both trying to do two things. So Bill Shorten was really ambitious and had, probably too many things to campaign on. What is it this time around? And I know you've just explained the under 40s and the Conservatives say he's not conservative enough, and the culture war stuff. But is it just that the message isn't narrow enough? Is it not honed enough?
I think it comes back to a core sort of policy problem. I think they weren't ambitious enough. Look, there's still time, but up to date, they're not being ambitious enough in that sort of economic reform space. So what happens is, we see those voters on the right flank that were on their pile sort of earlier in the campaign. So there's people that are coming off. If you want to hold those people in the face of sort of more socially conservative kind of positioning from, One Nation and Palmer United, and not Palmer United, Trumpet for Patriots and those sorts of things, you've got to give them a reason to stay. And the reason to stay has to be economic. It's exactly the same problem Labor's got on its left flank. Yeah. You've got to give those voters an economic reason to stay. And we know those voters, this is where you get this weird wraparound in Australian politics. We know those voters on the Liberal right flank are similar to the voters on the Labor left flank in wanting to see reform that addresses these kinds of power inequalities, inequities in the Australian sort of economy
Sure,
that
but what about the
makes them
middle?
feel like they're.
I mean, the middle's still where elections are won, right? As you say, some of these key seats have now a bigger block of millennials overtaking baby boomers. They have, a different set of values and priorities. Can the coalition still win it from here, or at least get to minority to negotiate? Or do you think that ship is sailed or sailing?
Look, I think everything would have to go perfectly, spectacularly right for them, and everything would have to go perfectly wrong for Labor. I think there's, they've run out of runway. Basically, is sort of where I think we're at. I think the announcements on the weekend, particularly the housing one, was well tuned to those outer suburban electorates that they want to go after. That I think that would help arrest some of the decline that we're seeing there. But it's in a competitive space because Labor's got its own policy thing around housing that seems a little bit more tuned to sort of middle suburbs, more so than outer suburbs. That the emphasis, with the Liberals' emphasis being on that new home builds, I think sort of makes that a more natural home to the outer suburbs. But I think because housing is a contested space that they've walked into there, I think it might arrest the decline, but I don't think it provides a necessary sort of fillip to the vote because it's contested. I think they're running out of time, and I think the moment was probably about 4 weeks ago to really come out and start talking about sort of economic reform to address these underlying inequities, even for the middle sort of, I wouldn't say middle class, but sort of that middle, lower middle class, working class kind of voter in these outer suburban electorates wants to see that kind of thing as well. And it's the failure to articulate that at that critical point when people were just starting to tune in to, oh, okay, yeah, there's an election coming, I better start making up my mind. They, for a lot of people, that was first impressions, and first impressions last. And at that point, they were kind of absent. They were talking about cutting public servants and getting rid of work from home, and that was what people heard, and that's what's stuck in people's mind. Even to now, the working from home stuff still sticks in people's minds.